And we talk about, does God hide in there? Maybe he hides in some stories more than others because he wants us to do the seeking.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author and speaker. Raise your hand if your favorite subject in school was English. Okay, I can't see your hands, but mine was raised. It was my favorite subject, so shout out to all the English teachers out there for helping us learn to communicate well, appreciate the written word, and for introducing us to the elements of a good story. In this episode, we ask the question, is God hiding in good literature? And to help answer that, I've enlisted one of my daughter's favorite teachers, Nancy Gourde. Though this child of mine, now a teacher herself, had a string of favorite educators who inspired her from her high school years, Mrs. Gourde stands out as one especially adored. Perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of why this is as we move together through the question of the moment, is God hiding in good literature? Let's dive in. Well, thanks so much, Nancy, or Mrs. Gourde, as I've known you most of the years, for joining us here in the Forum podcast booth today. I'm eager to explore this idea of whether God can reveal himself to us through good literature, and I thought it necessary to qualify with the word good here, because obviously not all literature has a higher purpose or is equal. And so not all literature is inherently good, I would say. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But for now, why don't we start with hearing a little bit of your good story, particularly how it relates to your discovery of good literature and how that inspired you to teach the subject. So going a little bit back into your personal history to get to know you.
Oh, I'd love to share some of that with you, Roxanne. Everyone loves a good story, including those to whom sitting down with a book is not necessarily the idea of a great time. But I am someone who gravitates toward libraries and bookstores and carousel holding paperback racks.
Yeah.
I think of books as companions. And I find that I return to the same stories, some short, some of great length, over and over. And that doesn't necessarily mean rereading them. It can mean recalling, referencing, and once again, embracing those story memories with not only the mind, but the heart. And I relate these stories to other stories. Now, many people do the same. Just look at all the book clubs and discussion groups there are, both in person and online. Now, this led to my wanting to teach the subject of English because I, like many people, wanted to share the reading experience, to spread the good words found in books. I think it important to encourage young people to read examples of several genres written by authors whose voices bring diverse views of the human experience. I recall being told that students will always remember the enthusiasm you have for the subject you teach. And that enthusiasm for English was something I had hoped to share.
That's beautiful. I'm gonna take you back into your childhood. Do you recall how was that instilled in you? I know that my mom was an elementary teacher, so she had books everywhere. And after school, we'd always be in her room in the little corner, and we were exposed to that. And then my dad was a junior high English teacher, and also a writer. And so, as children, we were exposed to words and stories, and my dad would also make up little stories, and he would put names of two little girls who had similar names to my sister and me. So that really brought us into the story, and I think that was so beautiful, and I realized later how instrumental that was. But, and also my sister taught me how to read when I was 4 because she had already learned, and she was just a year and a half, not even a year and a half older. So, so those are some memories I have of what drew me into words and stories. And what was it for you? Do you remember back into your childhood? Who introduced you to stories?
Well, my mother was not an avid reader of books. She was a great fan of all sorts of magazines. But my aunt and my uncle, my mother's sister and brother, were avid readers. And I remember boxes of paperbacks, Louis L'Amour books, Mickey Spillane novels sitting around. And so many people to me were examples of great readers. And they read to me. Roxanne, I remember toting around little golden books. I remember always getting books as gifts. I remember the Madeline books so very fondly. And then all the collections of like the Bobbsey twins and Nancy Drew. People recognized, I think early on, that love and interest I had. My parents memorized some golden books because I wanted them read to me so often. They didn't even need to have the book in front of them. My mother could tell me the story doing dishes, putting clothes on the line. Because we just, human beings just love stories.
Yes.
Even if we don't relish books as companions, even if we don't relish that tactile experience of holding a book, everyone loves a good story.
Right. And you're provoking a memory earlier than the ones that I have of my parents, which I know they preceded this, but I did go to a babysitter when I was really young and my parents were teaching. And Mrs. Anderson, she was a widow. She had some kids that were like high school age, but every day before naps, she had this big long couch and she had a book room, and we got to go pick a book and sit on her lap. And, that's a memory too from when I was probably 3. So there were other things. And I remember going to my grandma's house in Bismarck on vacation, and she would always have gone to the library to get the Bobbsey twins or whatever, Flicka, Dicka, and Ricka. And so, yeah, I think we don't always realize the bed we were planted in and the little seeds that people planted around us. It's only later that you can look back and appreciate all those moments that brought you to this love of literature.
Right. And for some of us, losing recess it's just like a punishment. For me, losing reading time was the same thing. That comfort, that settling down, that being one with the word.
Right.
It was so important to me growing up. And Roxanne, it still is. I always want to have a book by my side. And I love to discover new books and new authors. And I love it when people recommend books to me. And I swear a bibliophile can sense another bibliophile a mile away.
Absolutely. There's something about stories that, they're kind of neutral in that we can't really argue with a story. It's a story. And yes, maybe there's something didactic in there to learn from or whatever. But sometimes it's just a story of a life. And there's so much divisiveness right now. But I think stories are something that can bring us together. And so that is something. What is it about a good story? Maybe you could, why our story? You kind of touched on that, why they're so powerful. But what is it about a good story that touches the human heart and stirs our souls? Is there something concrete that we can kind of name as something that good stories have?
Well, I definitely think there are commonalities. And a good story is one that touches and stirs us. And it has characters in it, I find, consistently, who are other-centered rather than self-centered. And we see examples of their compassion, their sacrifices, and often their suffering on behalf of others. And we witness their concern for the welfare and safety of their community, their willingness to share their talents and energy to make things better, to work for the common good. Now, whether it is a group of city dwellers who plant a community garden, a lady detective who solves problems and eases the worries of her friends, a 12-year-old who questions authority and risks his life to save a child, a lawyer who believes he's wasted his life, who takes the place of another about to be executed, or a young Dutch woman risking her life to bring supplies to Jews in hiding. Their actions are so touching and inspiring, the words so memorable. I think of Pollyanna with her curiosity, her positivity, her optimism. I think of Anne Frank, whose line in the play comes from her diary. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. We see their goodness, their hopefulness, and through that, we feel hope. We believe we can be good.
Well, you just illuminated a few specific stories. What are some, and give us the titles of ones
certainly.
that you've come back to again and again, like you say, you return to and maybe even introduce. You've been a long-time teacher. Well, now you retire, but you never retire from teaching. Right?
No.
How many years were you a teacher, English teacher?
Here in Fargo, 24 years,
Okay.
I taught English.
Okay.
And for some of that time, I also taught the beginning years of Spanish, sort of the exploratory elective courses, and then Spanish 1 and a little bit of Spanish 2. But I was primarily in language arts and English. And as much as I love literature, I love grammar almost as much. So that was another element of the subject that was attractive to me.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of titles, Roxanne, I could go on forever, but there are a couple of, actually about 5 titles that I will mention. I'm very fond of the stories of O. Henry, and many people may find them to be sentimental, but they're so rewarding in that most of the time, they have a happy ending or a good result or something positive happens. And 2 of those I'd like to mention by O. Henry are A Retrieved Reformation and The Last Leaf. Both of these short stories have characters who use their talents. And actually, they use their talents to save someone. And one, in A Retrieved Reformation, Jimmy Valentine is a safecracker. And even though it's going to cost him his freedom, he is willing to save another. And he does it, Roxanne, out of love. The other one, where there's a sacrifice made out of love through the use of one's talents, is The Last Leaf. And that has to do with a not very successful older artist who paints his masterpiece to save a young woman dying of pneumonia. Those titles I go back to. Flowers for Algernon is one, Roxanne, that it was in my 8th grade curriculum, and we read a great deal of it aloud. We did the short story version of the title. It was later made into a full-length book, and it's been a musical, it's been a movie, made for TV movie. But there's something so touching about Charlie Gordon that when you read his words, I want to be smart like everyone else. Don't cry for me, Miss Kinnian. I know I did something for science, but I can't remember what. And when you know what this person has undergone to better himself in this experimental surgery to improve his intelligence And he does it not only for himself, but for everyone else who suffers from the same sort of condition. And it doesn't end well. It is so touching that he is so modest. And it's one of the most poignant stories I've ever read. Too soon a woman, with the character of Mary, who is going to save the children in her care by testing a mushroom to see if it's poisonous or not. And that scene when she is waiting through the night to see if she's going to survive and to see if she can slice up that mushroom and saute it for the children who are starving. It is one of the most powerful scenes in a short story that I can recall. And the Scarlet Ibis, it talks about the complexities of the sibling relationship, what it is to be a brother, what it is to have a disabled brother, to feel pride and love and selfishness all together. That recollection and the words, "Brother, don't leave me," will absolutely break your heart. And it's these stories you return to over and over again because it again, Roxanne, it is the sacrifice. It is the willing to do something on behalf of others that comes back to us over and over again.
And we cheer for those heroes, I think, and we want those examples. We need those examples in our world. And I wonder if we're kind of at a point where we're needing them all the more right now. I don't know your thoughts about that, or if it just seems like it's a time where we're seeing so many things in the news and social media. And I know the world has always had this good and this bad. But right now I think we're seeing so many of the other examples a little bit that when we see those heroes or hear those stories of heroic, it's kind of surprising and beautiful, and it inspires us.
Oh, indeed. And it doesn't have to be a grandiose, epic sort of hero. It can be someone who lives a very modest life, someone who goes about his or her work very quietly. But something as simple as reading a story or a book where a young teenager scoots down so someone else can join them at the lunch table, someone who was obviously looking for a place to sit. It's such a small thing. But what did it mean to that person who felt adrift in that sea of young teenagers in that cafeteria? The small little acts of kindness that you see in stories. Yes, you can sit with us. Oh, I'm sorry you forgot your lunch. I'll share mine. I have too much anyway. And it's all these little things that we see and we go, I can do that. I mean, that is the very least I can do. And I know I'm going to reference Pollyanna more than once here today. But Pollyanna, the literary character, I said, if you look for the bad, you're going to find it. But if you look for the good, you will find that. And I think that's what we want to find in our stories. We want to find good things that whether we're reading a Western about someone who cleans up a rough frontier town, or whether we're reading a mystery where someone solves a crime that really brings someone to justice or brings some resolution to other people. They're using their talents, their strengths, their will in a positive way. And we need to see that. We need to seek the good.
Yeah. Now, I love that you're articulating that goodness in literature and in stories doesn't have to have a certain faith bend. But as Christians, we have our stories too, starting with the story, right? The Bible is a story. Yeah. And one of the best descriptions, I think, of the Bible is that it's a love story between God and his people. Like he's showing us his love. How does, because you taught in a parochial school, a Christian school, and so how did that how did you weave some of that into your teaching? And then also I'm curious about a favorite saint story, because as you're talking about these heroes, I'm thinking about these great stories that we have in our faith history as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a blessing for me to be able to teach in a Catholic school, because look at exactly what we're talking about here. Now, everything that I have said, I could say in a public venue, in a public school. But when you're in a Christian school, in my case, a Catholic school, you can totally bring it back to Christ and to address Christ-like characters, Christ-like attributes. One book that I reference a great deal, and actually it was a required read for AP Lit, but How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And Foster has an entire chapter of what it is to be a Christ-like character. What are those attributes we find in literature that are Christ-like? And it's just so wonderful to be able to reference whether you're talking about the commandments, whether you're talking about the Beatitudes, whether you're talking about a saint. Doesn't this remind you of Saint Joseph? It is so wonderful to be able to do that.
Yeah. I love that you can be explicit about that, and that is our faith. That's the story of us and of humanity, really, and we want to share that. So, well, I'm going to take a little pause here and let us exhale, but I do also want to kind of just touch on kind of more of a controversial topic. We don't have to go deeply into it, but this topic of banned books, which I think Christians are often blamed for. And I just kind of want to hear your thoughts about that. So we'll take a little pause and we will talk more with Nancy Gourde and literature, good literature, on the other side of this break.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
We are back with Matters of Soul Importance with Nancy Gourde, a longtime English teacher, book enthusiast, and analyzer of various books and stories.
Of all things written, right?
That's right. And we've been talking about the goodness of books and the goodness of stories. And also, before the break, we mentioned that not all books are equal, and there's also this controversy that has kind of come and gone, and I think really resurfaced lately about banned books, and should books ever be banned in a free country? And I'm really curious from your perspective as a teacher, and especially of these tender souls that you have guided in the area of literature. How have you maneuvered through that, and kind of where are you at now with it? What are some thoughts that you have about whether books should ever be banned? What is freedom in that regard? Do we have a responsibility as we're nurturing our children to be discerning?
Right. And I have given a great deal of thought, and I have discussed this issue with many people with different age groups. And we were talking a little bit during our break about it not only depends on the subject matter, but the way in which this subject matter is handled. That it's handled carefully and respect for the human. But years ago, I was given a coffee mug, with titles of often banned books written all over it. Now, the titles, were blacked out as though by a permanent marker. Now, when the cup became heated by steaming hot coffee, the black marks disappeared and the titles emerged. And several of those titles were books I had either been required to read or had required my students to read. Titles such as To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, The Great Gatsby, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. As a matter of fact, James and the Giant Peach was on that mug. Now, there were also titles on the mug I would not recommend or make available to students because, in my opinion, the violence, the sexual situations, the language, or the disturbing nature of the plot far outweighed any redemptive value. Now, many of the classics that have great meaning and relevance to our age were banned because they were considered provocative. Does this mean they should have been banned? Should be banned? Does their redemptive value, their message, overcome the provocation? And the test of time says yes. Also to consider, and I think about this all the time, who is doing the banning? What if inspiring, memorable books were banned because they were considered too Christian, too Catholic to have on a bookshelf? No matter how we feel about this issue, we do have a responsibility, especially to young readers, to suggest and encourage books of merit that spread the good word. And I always, always encourage parents to read what their children are reading.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking about a book, and it's like hidden. Like there's a story, it's hidden, and it's just a book. It seems so innocent.
Innocuous, right?
Yeah. And yet, words are powerful, either for the good or for the bad. And I'm not saying we should never read anything that challenges us, right? There's a difference there. But just as we're careful with our words and what we put on a billboard, we shouldn't think just because you can close this book that it's, like you said, innocuous. And I think one of the issues that I've really struggled with is I feel like a lot of issues in our world right now that are controversial are adults looking at things from their own perspective and not considering the perspective of the child and the child's growth. And you mentioned on break too that the development of the child very much matters. The brain is on a course. It can't always receive, it becomes more complex and can handle more complex things as the child grows. But that has to be something that's considered. It is not an easy topic because, as you're kind of hinting at, there's so many things, the times and what is around us and what the mature, things change. But I think the good literature is always probably going to be good in any time, the real good in literature. But what more do you have to say about the topic that can kind of appease people that I would say, you brought up say Christian books are banned, but I think Christians are kind of blamed. That's my perception for a lot of the banned books. Well,
and again, I really do want to say that sometimes you're just not ready for the story. And when you look at young readers and young minds, you're like, are they ready for this? And can they even understand the information and process it? I mean, are they ready for that? And I'll give you an example that when I was in 8th grade, I read Wuthering Heights. Now, Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte, it's a classic, right? I had no clue what was going on. Now, it was just simply because the complexity of the plot going back and forth between Cathys and what was going on, I wasn't ready for that. Well, it was years later, an 8th grade girl said to me, Mrs. Gourde, for my silent reading, I did Wuthering Heights, and I had no clue what was going on. And I said, welcome to the world of 8th grade girls who don't understand Wuthering Heights, because that included me. The themes, the plot, the message. And this is a book that is not necessarily objectionable because of language or situations. Sometimes thematically a story is difficult. And then if you have all kinds of language in there or hinge events and plots that are confusing to the child, it just might give an unrealistic version of the world to just kind of think, oh, is this something this 10-year-old is ready for? But going back, you mentioned the Christians banning books or being concerned about this, but, we always have to go back to, all right, life is full of choices. God gave us free will. So the question is then, what do we choose to put on our bookshelves? Right? Now, just because we choose certain titles and make them available to others, especially to young people, that does not mean we burn the books we haven't chosen. We are making choices based on what we seek and what we find in the written word. Now, what is found can certainly vary from person to person because no two persons read the same book. That quote attributed to Edmund Munson, but there are commonalities in good books, some of which we've discussed some of the stories, and it's imperative to offer titles of age-appropriate literature to young people, to young minds.
I know we're not going to solve this whole topic right now. We could do another podcast, and maybe we will, but what advice would you have to parents who are kind of in that place of trying to discern all of this? Is there a way to do that and feel confident that you're not exposing your children to something before they're ready? Or is there anything like that? I don't know. Is there a resource?
Well, there are so many, I'm going to call them tried and true books. There's going to be rhythm about them. And I go way back to Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm or Heidi or Pollyanna, all the books by Louisa May Alcott, such things as An Old-Fashioned Girl. And expose your children to these. There are wonderful stories about young boys who are brave as only young boys can be. And there is goodness in their bravery. It's not just bravado. Go to those stories that have been around for a while and please read what you're going to give your child to read. Read that first. And then there are so many people, really, especially now with the proliferation of information online, search for good books for young minds and see what you can find and make them available. And as I mentioned the title to you, The Book of Lost Friends, this is something I would recommend to any reader ready to handle it just because of the very, very careful way with its language and the author's diction, the way it approaches difficult subjects that are timely. So these are these gems that you really have to share with young people. And it never hurts us to reread a juvenile book. Every time you read it, you have something else. One book I struggled with as a young person, and I still struggle with it, is Catcher in the Rye. And every time I read it, I get something different out of it. And I know that we think about seeking the good in books. Mm-hmm. You don't always find it, but you take that journey. Someone else, many, many people can find worthwhile things in books. And as long as it leads them to the good, they have found good or worth or merit in that story. And as long as it's that positivity, that optimism, that hope that it brings them, I am not going to say anything just because simply it didn't jump out at me, right? No two people read the same book. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe, it's the journey through it It's the attempt to seek and to find God. And we talk about, does God hide in there? Maybe he hides in some stories more than others because he wants us to do the seeking. He wants us to make that search. I mean, if he just was, here I am, I am obviously here with you. And God reveals himself to us in so many ways.
Right.
In so many circumstances. But I do think that if there are good things in a book, we need to share that. And I think that especially when there are books that are age appropriate, we really have to spread those good words among our young people.
Kind of going in that direction, I'm curious if you recall any moments from your teaching years where you witnessed a child being changed by a story. I'm sure there are many. I don't know if any pop out as memorable.
I've been thinking about this, and I had students journal about what they read. And it's research shows that when you write about what you've read, it increases reading comprehension as well. So the two go hand in hand. So I had them keep literary journals. And there are a few lines that I pulled out just simply because I wanted them as examples of what they might seek and what they read and reflections. So I can give you a few quotes. A response after reading Flowers for Algernon. I want to be a better friend. I have to be a better friend. After reading The Outsiders. Some people carry a lot of baggage. I must remember that not everybody's story is happy. After reading the poem, Those Winter Sundays, I'm going to call my father to thank him. After reading Christmas Day in the Morning, and this was an older reader, I'm going to call my son to tell him I love him. After reading The Hobbit, I am short, but I am strong. I am short, but I can be brave. And this is the last one, after reading Crime and Punishment, No Easy Feat. It is the most important, impactful book I have ever read. I need to forgive and be forgiven.
Beautiful. Thank you for mining those treasures for us. That is so, it's beautiful to hear how a heart was changed. And yes, the question posed at the beginning before the recording started today was, is God hiding in good literature? Is he playing peekaboo with us? Is he popping up? And I can see and imagine his joy as someone turns to him and draws to his heart from reading a good story. It seems like this isn't a big deal, but it could change a life, right?
And I believe it has. And these wonderful characters who do brave things, whether they may be considered mundane or whether they may be considered epic, they inspire us. And they could be true stories. I referenced early on a young Dutch woman risking her life to bring supplies to Jews in hiding. In the Diary of Anne Frank, Geese plays a huge role in that. I mean, she could have been seized and taken away at any given time. And it was fortunate. She lived a very long life. She lived past 100, but she put herself in great danger, and not just to give them food or writing materials, books, little things they might need to make their lives more comfortable, but also to have that positive face in front of them, not to let them know how truly horrible things were on the outside, because they were dealing with so much already. And look at just that gift she gave them. We talk about using our talents. There are the good characters, whatever talent it is, whether you're a safecracker or an artist. Meep worked with Mr. Frank. I mean, and she was a young wife. How she was so very brave. Look at in The Hobbit. I mean, what an adventure.
You're talking about the World War II, and I was just thinking, too, another aspect of it is it teaches us, it reminds us of history that we don't repeat. That's another huge outcome. Like, if we don't know our history, even if it's through a fictionalized work about World War II, we're bound to repeat it, right? And I think we can recognize the signs that we're repeating it through having read some of these stories. So that's another value. It's almost it could save our lives in that way too, in a real practical way as well. I feel like, though, and I'm sure you agree, like there are fewer readers out there now, and so many people that I've talked to that are my age are struggling with it as well because of the internet, and we don't want to say it's all bad, but our reading retention has gotten poor. What would you say to encourage people to go back to the old book in front of the fireplace with a cup of cocoa?
Right. Oh, yes. To me, that's just a dream. I mean,
yes.
But, well, first of all, I'd say, be patient. Be patient with the book and be patient with yourself. And pace your reading, savor it. You're dining on words. Remember that worthwhile experiences include those we embrace, even though they may seem daunting. And, let the story develop and, step within that story and lay the book down when you've had enough. Lay the book down when you need to reflect. You journal about what you have read. And then later, after a mind rest, pick the book up again. Resume the story, because every day, we resume the story.
I'm a highlighter and a noter. A noter.
Yes, I know.
My books are marked up. That's why I really, really don't want actual books to go away, because there's just something about it.
And I don't think they will. I really don't.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. I'm a firm believer, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote about this. The idea that everything is going to be an e-book, or you're going to download it onto some tablet, or you're going to read things from a computer. This was some years ago, but I was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, and we did not have enough paper. I mean, year after year, you try to squeeze every little molecule out of the paperbacks you have, and so we had a very beaten up bunch of books. All right. So my last class of the day, the fourth class, we ran short of paperbacks. And I said, well, what we'll do in this class is part of the common domain. We'll read it. This class will have computer time. We'll read it online. Because it was getting close to the end of the year and book orders, to make a book order at that time. Do you know how much that group of 25 felt cheated out of an experience? Why don't we have a book? Why don't we have a book we can hold in our hands? I mean, they did not embrace that electronic reading experience one iota, Roxanne. And I went down to the office. I said, you've got to find me 25 paperback copies of To Kill a Mockingbird. They want them. And I really believe that tactile experience, that turning of the page, your fingers on the printed word, it really does make a difference. And you look now at bookstores and libraries, I mean, they're busy. Yeah. They're busy places.
Yeah. I'm sure you're this way. I'm a visual learner, and I remember what side of the page if I want to.
Oh,
find
without a
something,
doubt.
like,
I know
you
exactly.
Can't do that with,
I may not know the page number, but I know what side and about how far back it is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, you talk about highlighting books. That's what's tough about getting books from the library. You're like,
yes.
I really want to circle this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I have a final question for you. I so appreciate what you've shared today, but this is kind of one that's maybe a little bit more personal, or maybe, I'm not sure, but I'll just throw it at you. When God speaks to you through a good book, what do you hear him saying most of all? And you've given us so many beautiful examples of others and some of these students and what they took from things and what how their heart was changed. What is the message that you get the most?
The message I get the most, Roxanne, is that we need to care for and love one another just as God cares for and loves us. And we must work for the common good as we reach out in whatever way our talents, our energy, ourselves are capable. We are all part of the story he has written. And we need to acknowledge the role we play in that story.
We're all characters.
Indeed,
yes.
Indeed.
So I don't know if that's going to inspire you. I know I want to go and find one of my books that I haven't read yet. I have a nice list that I'm just waiting to get at, and I think it's time. I'm going to go on a retreat this weekend, and maybe I can sneak in a few minutes here and there. But I really appreciate this, Nancy.
Oh, of course,
the value
it was
of
my
a good
pleasure.
Book. Yes. Yeah. You have a wealth of information and in your mind and your heart, and I appreciate you all that you've given to so many young people and
thank you.
And others through the years. So, God bless you.
God bless you as well.
Is God hiding in good literature? Nancy Gourde offers an affirmative yes to this question. I was impressed with the number of stories she holds within her memory bank and the treasures she's found within them. Listening to her reminded me of what a gift it is to find those stolen moments with a good book, or the feeling of curling up with my children when they were little and reading them stories before nap time. I read some so many times that I memorized them, like Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs, and 2 little kittens, and a pair of mittens, and a little toy house, and a young mouse, and a comb and a brush, and a bowl full of mush, and a quiet old lady who was whispering, "Hush." Such a simple little book, but so rich in memories of connecting with my young ones, pouring those words into their hearts, and I hope helping them feel secured and loved. What are your memories of books, your favorite titles, the books you have on your shelves that are like a jewel to you? What titles have you always wanted to read but never quite found the time? Maybe the time is now. And even more to the point, have you ever found God hiding in any of those beloved titles? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop me a line through my contact form at roxannesolonen.com or email me directly at roxannebsolonen@gmail.com. I'll return in a couple of weeks with episode 6 when I ask guest Elizabeth Kelly, author of the award-winning book Jesus Approaches, "Can suffering ever be good?" If the reality of suffering, and especially how it could possibly be part of a good God's plan, has ever perplexed you, you'll want to hear from this very thoughtful woman as she grapples with the question at hand in real time, moving through both MS and cancer. What has she learned in this journey about God's movements and intentions during our suffering? We'll find out soon. Until then, don't lose sight of the light.